Okay, good evening. Welcome. Thanks for coming out tonight. And this includes our 8-week series on the history of Christian thought. So tonight, we're going to conclude our series with a look at another mode of modern Christian theology. Well, not necessarily mainstream, but has nonetheless become influential, especially in developing nations and in minority communities in the United States. And here I am referring to what has become known as liberation theology. In general, liberation theology refers to an aspect of Christian thinking that requires the removal of forms of oppression, especially towards the powerless and the exploited. The term can be applied both in general or to specific historical movements within Christendom. In general, liberation theology can be defined as an interpretation of Jesus' teachings that focuses on the poor and the removal of unjust economic, political, and social conditions. It has been described by its proponents as, quote, an interpretation of Christian faith through the poor's suffering, their struggle and hope, and a critique of society and Christianity through the eyes of the poor. They claim that liberation is a major theme of the Gospels, which if you read them, it certainly is. As throughout their pages, Jesus is constantly calling for his followers to care for the poor and dispossessed in their midst. Among biblical passages they point to, perhaps the most well-known, Matthew 25:32, when Jesus' disciples ask him when they cared for him, and Jesus replies, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." But more specifically, that's in general. Liberation theology has come to refer to two modern movements, one of whose genesis was in the United States and another in Latin America. The movement in the United States, referred to as the social gospel, traces its roots back to the 19th century, if not earlier. It was mentioned last week by Reverend Albert, and then was carried forward in the following decades by both Catholic and Protestant advocates such as Dorothy Day and Walter Rauschenbusch. The movement in Latin America began in the 1950s and 60s and was primarily Catholic in orientation. So tonight I'm going to begin with the Catholic movement in Latin America, then return briefly to the U.S. variation as expressed in the civil rights movement, and conclude with an example of liberation theology as found in India. So liberation theology began as a movement within the Roman Catholic Church in Latin America, arising principally as a moral reaction to the poverty caused by perceived social injustice in the region. For example, these slums in Rio de Janeiro. It stressed both heightened awareness of the sinful socioeconomic structures. It's important to remember that. The structures are sinful, that caused social inequalities, and an active participation in trying to change those structures. Its proponents perceived that the Roman Catholic Church in Latin America was fundamentally different from the Church in Europe, and that the Church in Latin America should be actively engaged in improving the lives of the poor. Actively engaged. The birth of the movement is usually dated to the Latin American Bishops' Conference, which was held in Medellin, Colombia in 1968. At the conference, the attending bishops issued a document affirming the rights of the poor, asserting that industrialized nations enrich themselves at the expense of developing countries. There the bishops proclaimed, quote, "There are in existence many studies of the Latin American people. All of these studies describe the misery that marginalizes large masses of human beings in all our countries. That misery as a collective fact is an injustice that cries to the heavens." The movement's seminal text, written by Gustavo Gutierrez, and I'm going to say much more about him in a moment, was a text called A Theology of Liberation. As a result of the conference, the movement, and it became a movement, gained strength throughout Latin America during the 1970s. In order to establish what they called a Church of Liberation, base communities were established, where local Christian groups comprised of members from marginalized sections of society and led primarily by lay persons, along with priestly involvement when possible. So they're trying to build these grassroots communities to try and help solve the problems that the poor and the marginalized were facing. These communities studied the Bible and attempted to meet parishioners' needs for food, water, sewage, disposal, electricity, things that we all take for granted. As a result of these efforts, a great number of such communities sprang up throughout Latin America. Now, whenever you have a movement that catches on and things start going well, and it tends to be negative towards the hierarchy, what can you expect? A bit of trouble. Resistance, yeah. Because their insistence that ministry should include involvement in the political struggle for the poor and the victimized against the wealthy elites, liberation theologians began to be quickly criticized, both from within the Catholic Church and by the political leadership in various countries, calling them naive purveyors of communism and radical advocates of leftist social activism. By the 1990s, Pope John Paul II had begun to curb the movement's influence. How did he do that? He began to appoint more conservative bishops in Brazil and elsewhere in Latin America. But despite the Orthodox bishop's predominance, a more radical form of liberation theology continued to get much support throughout Latin and South America. So I want to look now at the three outstanding theologians who were involved in this liberation of theology movement. The aforementioned Gustavo Gutierrez, a man by the name of Leonardo Boff of Brazil, and John Sobrino of El Salvador. So let's turn our attentions to the lives and thoughts of these gentlemen. Gustavo Gutierrez, born June 8, 1928 in Lima, Peru. A Peruvian theologian, as well as an ordained Dominican priest, widely considered to be the father of liberation theology, which I mentioned because of his book. He was ordained a priest in 1959, studied medicine and literature in Peru, at the Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium, and then later at the Gregorian University in Rome. He obtained a doctorate of theology at the Catholic University of Lyon, served as parish priest at Christ the Redeemer Church in Rimac, Peru, and in 1974 founded what was known as the Bartolomé de las Casas Institute in Lima, specifically to minister to the poor. He also taught at the Pontifical University of Peru and at many universities in Europe and throughout North America, including the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana, where he is, and still is, holds the chair of John Cardinal O'Hara Professor of Theology. So this man is not only well-educated, he has served on all levels. So when he spoke, people took him seriously. In developing his theology, he was greatly influenced by the existing socialist current in the church that had existed with such organizations as the Catholic Worker Movement and the French Young Workers for Christ. The Catholic Workers Movement was a collection of autonomous communities of Catholics and their associates, initially in the United States, founded by Dorothy Day and a man by the name of Peter MAURIN in the United States in 1933. Its aim was to, quote, live in accordance with the justice and charity of Jesus Christ. One of its guiding principles was hospitality towards those on the margin of society, based on the principle of communitarianism. Communitarianism. Okay? This idea of the community. It's the community that is significant in being religious. Doctrine might come later. Community, behavior, worship. Yeah. He was also influenced by a book written by a man by the name of Paul Gutierrez, Christ, the Church, and the Poor. Gutierrez had lived in Nazareth, Palestine, Israel, from 56 to 67. He had been invited by the Archbishop of Galilee to speak at the Second Vatican Council. That was the famous Vatican II, where he called on the church to take a more active role in social justice. While he was in Palestine, he was part of a group called Companions of Jesus the Carpenter, providing aid to poverty-stricken people. Gutierrez was influenced by both of these movements, and he was later granted numerous degrees and awards from institutions throughout the world. Member of the French Legion of Honor, Peruvian Academy of Language, American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In his Theology of Liberation, the book I mentioned earlier, he proposed to fight poverty by addressing the source which engenders it, namely institutional social injustice. That's what he called sin. We tend to think of sin as individual things. He said sin is actually institutional. There was another book written by Reinhold Niebuhr called Moral Man, Immoral Society, in which he said individuals are essentially moral. Where the problem arises is when they get into when they get so big, you have all these institutions, and they become abstract, and the individual is kind of removed from the larger social institutions that are carrying this out. This idea actually goes way back. It goes back to Rousseau, back in the 18th century, when where he had this social contract. He said the problem is, once we get into societies, we have this other level of problem, which, if we're talking from this point of view, is sin. We, as individuals, we live pretty nice lives, but we're probably, if we're living in a big society, at some level, supporting an institution that is doing danger and damage. Sometimes so abstract you don't even know. If you want just an example, look at your stock holdings. Okay? Most of us don't think it's a problem to have stocks, but how many of you actually go in and look, what's going on with this company? What are they doing? Where are they producing their... Okay? That's an example of institutional sin. And that's what he was trying to focus on. And to fight that, you can't just have an individual. You need the backing of the church. That's what he was... And that's why he began to get in trouble. In any case, So the book's principal innovation is seeing theology from the perspective of the poor and the oppressed. Thus, Christ as Savior liberates the human race from sin, which is the root of all injustice and oppression, by proclaiming the way. It's not necessarily just what you believe, it's what you are doing. Are you following Jesus' way? His argument is, if you're following Jesus' way, social injustice will tend to be dealt with. Not totally, but at least you're starting. The way isn't just about my way. The way is about our way. So it's this communal. So he popularized the phrase preferential option for the poor. Became his phrase, which became a slogan of liberation theology and eventually actually an official doctrine of the Catholic Church. Now here he asserts that God is revealed as having a preference for those people who are insignificant, marginalized, unimportant, needy, despised, defenseless. The idea here is a little bit like what we might have called affirmative action. He doesn't mean that the poor are there, and we should, just because a person's poor, he's better than a person who's rich. But because of those circumstances, because what they live in, we should be giving them preference to try and raise them out of it. Otherwise, nothing will ever change. That's what he means by preferential. He doesn't necessarily mean because you're wealthy, you're a sinner. What he's saying is that if we're going to deal with this structurally, and that's the only way to deal with it, to have any effect, we have to do it in this manner. So it's only within the framework of this universality that he says we can understand what comes first for a Christian. He also attempts to make clear that terminology of the poor in Scripture has economic connotations and consequences. In other words, there are consequences to what we do or don't do. There are consequences to what we don't do. He emphasized what he called praxis or practice over doctrine. Praxis over doctrine. His reading of the Old Testament prophets, whose tradition he asserts Jesus maintained, emphasizes their condemnation of oppression and injustice against the poor. Reverend Albert is going to be giving a Bible study on the prophets shortly, so this will tie in. And thereby informs his assertion that to know God, in other words, theology, is to do justice, practice. Listen to his words. I am firmly convinced that poverty, this subhuman condition in which the majority of humanity lives today, is a religious issue. Poverty poses a major challenge to every Christian conscience, and therefore to theology as well. Our context today is characterized by a glaring disparity between the rich and the poor. No serious Christian can quietly ignore this situation. It's no longer possible for someone to say, well, I didn't know about the suffering of the poor. Poverty has a visibility today that it did not have in the past. The faces of the poor must now be confronted, and we also understand the causes of poverty and the conditions that perpetuate it. There was a time when poverty was considered to be an unavoidable fate, but such a view is no longer possible or responsible. Now we know that poverty is not simply a misfortune, it's an injustice. An active concern for the poor is not only an obligation for those who feel a political vocation. All Christians must take the gospel message of justice and equality seriously. Christians cannot forgo their responsibility to say a prophetic word about unjust economic conditions. You see why he got in trouble? That's laying it on the line, isn't it? That's laying it on the line. In this regard, Gutierrez's brand of liberation theology is sometimes called an interpretation of revelation as history. For example, he wrote, "History is the scene of the revelation God makes of the mystery of his person. His word reaches us in the measure of our involvement in the evolution of history. And our evolution spiritually calls us at this time to oppose social injustice." That ties in with what he was saying earlier. We can no longer say, nothing can be done. We have evolved to the point where things can be done. We have the power to do it. The question is, do we have the will? Do we have the will? So he pointed to his doctrine of universal salvation as exemplifying it through the role of liberation. He has a number of books. If you're interested, this is one of his most famous, Las Casas, In Search of the Poor of Jesus Christ, The God of Life, We Drink from Our Own Wells, The Spiritual Journey of a People, etc., etc. Leonard Boff, theologian, philosopher, writer who currently serves as Professor Emeritus of Ethics, Philosophy of Religion, and Ecology at the Rio de Janeiro State University. He entered the Franciscan order in 1959, ordained as a priest in 1964. He spent the following years studying for a doctorate in theology and philosophy at the University of Munich, which he received in 1970. His doctoral thesis studied in what measure the church can be a sign of the sacred and the divine in a secular world, especially as regards the process of liberation of the poor and the oppressed. He claims what lies behind liberation theology is a societal scandal, which exists not only in Latin America, but the entire third world, and indeed in parts of our country as well. And without a minimum, and this is important for Boff, without a minimum of suffering with the suffering, without that minimum that affects the great majority of the world, we can really not have a theology that we can understand. In other words, suffering isn't just here. I understand that you're all suffering. Okay, I'll help you. Suffering with. That's what compassion means. Come with. Compassion. Having true compassion. And so he became immediately a very controversial figure in the church, primarily because of its hierarchy, which he saw as fundamentalist, and his conflict with another gentleman, Cardinal Ratzinger, who would later become Pope Benedict XVI. Of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, this is what Boff wrote in 1984. And he was a cardinal at that time. A cardinal like Joseph Ratzinger, who publishes an official paper stating that the only true church is the Catholic Church, and that others aren't even churches, this would become the Pope, that the only legitimate religion is Catholicism, and this is after Vatican II, which he opposed, by the way, and that others don't even possess a faith, just belief, perpetrates religious terrorism besides being a grave theological error. Now, Ratzinger was very high in the power structure. Boff has been an advocate of human rights, criticized the role of the church in the social economic order that oppressed communities they worked in. In this regard, he claimed, "When future generations judge our time, they will call us barbarian inhuman and shameless for our great insensitivity to the suffering of our own brothers and sisters. He's also been involved in the creation of thousands of these earlier mentioned base Christian communities among poor Catholics in Brazil and Latin America. Again, as noted earlier, such communities are parish units with greater lay administration and quasi-sacramental roles. The reason that there weren't enough priests. And if you know, in the Catholic Church, that the sacrament has, and so they would one way to do it, they'd have a central area where the wine and then they'd send it out. But they've also had to allow some lay people to move in, which the higher orthodoxy wasn't real happy with, by the way. They are considered by orthodoxy as a rejection of the current organizational structure of the church. And they say they're designed to supplant the church. Such views and activities led Boff into a confrontation in 1985, what is known as the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, directed by Joseph Ratzinger, silenced him for a year for the publication of his book, Church, Charisma, and Power. He was almost silenced again in 1992 to prevent him from participating in the ECHO 92 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. This finally led him to leave the Franciscan religious order and the priestly ministry. He's written more than 100 books translated into the main languages of the world. In 2001, he was awarded the Right Livelihood Award by the Swedish Parliament. Our third liberation theologian is John Sobrino. Born into a Basque family in Barcelona, entered the Jesuit order when he was 18 years old. The following year, he went to El Salvador. He later studied engineering at St. Louis University in Missouri, then theology in Frankfurt, West Germany. Returning to El Salvador, he taught at the Central American University, which is run by the Jesuits. And if you know anything about the Jesuits, when it comes to intellectual life, it's top notch. They are the intellectuals of the Catholic community. On November 16, 1989, he narrowly escaped being assassinated by the Salvadorian government. By coincidence, he was away from El Salvador when members of the military broke into the rectory of the Central American University and brutally murdered 6 fellow Jesuits, their housekeeper, and her 15-year-old daughter. They were targeted for their outspoken work to bring about resolution to the El Salvador social struggle that had left 75,000 men, women, and children either missing or dead. Does anyone remember this? It was. Anyway, his major works include Jesus the Liberator, Christology at the Crossroads, The True Church and the Poor, and his most famous, No Salvation Outside the Poor. All of which promote liberation theological themes. As an example of his message, he writes the following in this work. In the Gospels, the people are the main reference to Jesus' life. Without the people, we cannot understand his everyday life. Jesus was deeply moved by the people's suffering. He gave hope to the poor, proclaimed the good news of God's reign. He mysteriously tells the crowd of hungry and thirsty, sick and naked, foreigners and prisoners that he, the Son of Man, is one of them. Because of his theological positions in March of 2007, Sobrino was the subject and the admonishment by the Vatican of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. Ratzinger. The congregation declared his work contains propositions which are either erroneous or dangerous and may cause, and this is where they, and may cause harm to the faithful. The congregation did not prohibit him from teaching or lecturing. That was to be decided by the local bishops. But the local bishops were being the conservative local bishops. So his local bishop said he could not teach or lecture in his archdiocese. According to the archbishop, Sobrino placed too great an emphasis on the human nature of Jesus, downplaying his divine nature. At the root of what the Vatican and many bishops saw as Sobrino's theological error was his affirmation that the Church of the Poor is the true setting of Christology. In contrast, the Vatican believes it is only the apostolic faith which the Church represents that constitutes the true setting. Tradition. Okay, so that's basically the Catholic version of liberation theology in Latin America. If we turn to liberation theology in this country, it made an impact in both Catholic and Protestant circles during a period which most of us remember, the Civil Rights era. It impacted the views and activities of Martin Luther King Jr., especially in his last years. Here, King was heavily influenced by the previously mentioned Walter Rauschenbusch's Christianity and the Social Crisis, which was written near the end of the 19th century, which he read when he was studying at the Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. He read this, was very much moved by it. He felt that this now gave him a theological basis for the concerns he was coming to hold as a result of what he saw as American racism. He was looking for some theological, and this book gave it to him. Rauschenbusch and other advocates of the social gospel claimed that in order to be relevant, the church must address itself to social issues. The phrase that was used was, "Whosoever carries the word must make the word flesh." The word in itself is not enough. This went against the prevailing view that the church at that time, if you can believe it, should have no say in politics. Do you remember those days? I can remember them. King had actually seen Rauschenbusch's ideal expressed in an early age by his father. Most of us don't remember there was a Martin Luther King Sr., who was a very well-known Baptist preacher and pastor. And he saw him do this when he encouraged his congregation to register to vote in 1935. Now we say today, that register to vote, okay, it still gets problems. But in 1935, that was dangerous. That was dangerous. Thus, by the time of the Montgomery bus boycott, King had made the social gospel a foundation stone of his personal theology, most powerfully expressed years later during the Poor People's Campaign, 1968, just prior to his assassination. This is what he said. But something else came to my mind. God comes in the picture even when the church won't take a stand. God has injected a principle into the universe. God has said that all men must respect the dignity and worth of all human personality. And if you don't do that, I will take charge. That's God. It seems this morning that I can hear God speaking. Can you hear, how he preaches, yeah. I can hear him speaking through the universe saying, "Be still and know that I am God." And if you don't stop, if you don't straighten up, if you don't stop exploiting poor people, I'm going to rise up and break the backbone of your power. and your power will be no more. I looked at Britain, and I thought about the Britain that could at one time boast, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And I said, now she had gone to the level that the sun hardly rises on the British Empire, because it was based on exploitation, because the God of the universe eventually takes a stand. And I say to you this morning, my friends, rise up and know that as you struggle for justice, you do not struggle alone, but God struggles with you. And he is working every day. Somehow I can look out. I can look out across the seas and across the universe and cry out, mine eyes have seen the glory. Then I think about it, because his truth is marching on. That's touching stuff to me. Anyway, that was how liberation theology was being expressed during the civil rights movement. People were doing what normally they wouldn't do. I mean, even white kids going down to the South, some of them getting murdered, for a movement, for a cause that they felt was religious and God inspired. Anyway, as we know, Martin Luther King was assassinated. And then the movement took another turn. It's sometimes called Black Power, which unfortunately in some ways is somewhat misunderstood. But there was another theologian by the name of James Cone, black theologian, a professor of systematic theology at Union Theological Seminary, whose 1969 book, Black Theology and Black Power, probably not a good name, provided a new way to articulate the distinctiveness of theology in the black church. His message was that black power, which he defined as black people asserting their humanity that white supremacy denied, was what the gospel should be all about in America. Jesus came, he said, to liberate the oppressed, advocating the same thing as black power. Now, unfortunately, most people think of black power, they think of a group called the Black Panthers, and Huey Newton and those guys, who were going, they said, look, at King's, that's not working. It's not working. The only thing that works in America is a gun. So that's when they went to that. So most people didn't realize that black power was much broader, especially when it's used by someone like Cone. He wasn't talking about getting guns and violence. He argued that white American churches preached the gospel based on white supremacy, which was antithetical to the gospel of Jesus. What is the goal of a black theology of liberation, he wrote? It is a society in which blacks are given special treatment and rights? No. All black theologians are asking for is for freedom and justice. No more, no less. In asking for this, the black theologians turned to Scripture as the sanction for their demand. The psalmist writes, for instance, if God is going to see righteousness established in the land, he himself must be particularly active as the helper of the fatherless, to deliver the needy when he crieth, and the poor that have no helper. Psalm 72:12. Karl Barth, the great white theologian, Protestant German theologian, who was not black, recognized the legitimacy of this demand. For this reason, Barth wrote, in the relations and events in the life of his people, God always takes his stand unconditionally and passionately on this side alone, against the lofty and on behalf of the lowly, against those who already enjoy right and privilege, and on behalf of those who are denied it and deprived of it. That's what he meant by black power, not taking guns. Okay, I want to finish up with one other expression of liberation theology, which a lot of people don't know about. It's called Dalit theology. It comes from India. It's a branch of liberation theology that emerged in the 1980s among the Dalit caste in India. Dalit is the new name for what used to be called untouchables. Okay. That name was taken on. And so Dalit theology sees hope in what they call the Nazareth Manifesto of Luke 4, where Jesus speaks of preaching good news to the poor, freedom for the prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind, and releasing the oppressed. A major proponent of Dalit theology was Arvind P. Nirmal, died in 1995, quite young, unfortunately. He was a Dalit Christian in the Church of North India. The Church of North India is the dominant United Protestant Church in North India, established in November of 1970, bringing together the Protestant churches in the North working together. It's a province of the Worldwide Anglican Community and a member of the World Methodist Council and the World Communion of Reformed Churches. Nirmal criticized upper-class dominance in Christian theology in India. Who was controlling the Christian communities? The upper castes. Believing the application of liberation theology to India should reflect a Dalit struggle, since Dalits make up 70% of the Christian community in India. It's interesting, I was in Ralph's the other day buying a donut, and there was an Indian lady saying, whenever I see someone from India, I always say, where are you from? And then I say, I was born there, and we get in a little bit of a conversation. And she was a Christian from Kerala. And she was telling me how at the moment Christians are now being persecuted by the Hindu fundamentalists. Yeah. It's always been the case to some degree, but it's picking up again. So in any case, I just thought I'd drop that in. So Dalit theologians quote gospel passages such as Jesus sharing common drinking vessel. They see Jesus as a Dalit. Jesus was an untouchable to the hierarchy. He did things you weren't supposed to do. He associated with sinners, with the impure, with the poor. And often the poor are not nice, and we shouldn't expect them to be. When you think of we can unfortunately get a romanticized view of the poor, and then when we go amongst them and they tell us stuff, then no wonder we don't like you. So in other words, when you're involved with the poor, it's not a romantic sort of thing. They said he was a Dalit. That's how they identify him in India. And he was giving a life. And what do they identify? And here's then a female, a lady. Her name is Evelyn Ruth Bhajan. She is a deacon in the Church of Pakistan. Stated that Dalit theology is vital in that it aligns the church's mission with the strategies based on the social, political, economic implications of liberation in Christ. She stated that this liberation includes liberation from persecution, segregation, as well as economic exploitation. And that's where it becomes sometimes tough. The parable of the Good Samaritan is very popular. It's seen as significant, providing a life-giving message to the marginalized Dalits and a challenging message to non-Dalits. In his book, Toward a Dalit Theology, E.M. Prampedkar suggested that Jesus experienced human and especially Dalit brokenness in his crucifixion. He has developed a Dalit creed, which reads in part, our cries for liberation from harsh caste bondage, the caste system in India, were heard by God, who came to us in Jesus Christ, to live with us and save all people from their sins. Okay, so what have been the responses of the church? Catholic churches, initially it was okay in the early 50s and 60s, and then they became very critical and at most times condemnational. The attitude has been seen liberation theology puts too much emphasis on the social and not enough on the individual. That's Ratzinger when he became Pope. Pope Benedict XVI was asked about this issue, and he stated that liberation theology has a major flaw in that it attempts to apply Christ's teachings in the Sermon on the Mount regarding the poor to present social situations. That was then. Things are different. We can't apply what he was doing then now. That's what Ratzinger was essentially saying. He believed that Christ's teaching on the poor means that we will be judged when we die at the final judgment with attention to how we personally treated the poor, not how we communally treated the poor. So as long as you are being nice to poor people, you'll be fine. But you don't have to do anything else. Yeah. And we come to Pope Francis. He remains a bit of an outsider to radical liberation theology. Remember, he's got a guide, a big ship. So he stayed sort of outside of that. But he's attempted to reduce the conflict. He's made use of certain theological ideas from liberation theology, mainly through symbolic gestures rather than through an official shift in position. For example, one of the first things he did when he became Pope is he washed a woman's feet outside of the Vatican as a symbol of this. He's also said in a number of speeches that the poor are to be given their voice, that eyes should be opened to the state of inequality in which many families live, that sleeves should be rolled up. Okay, so he's not being... It's sort of indirect here. So dignity can be restored. In the United States, the social gospel has received support from more progressive wings of both Catholic and Protestant churches, but has been criticized by more conservative elements as being overly radical in orientation and under the influence of left-wing political thinking, which undermines the Christian message of personal salvation. And I think that's what Albert was talking about last week with this sort of juggling between Christianity as a personal message of salvation and Christianity as a call to social activism at some level. Okay, that ends 8 weeks of something. And we're very, very thankful that you took time to come out and join us over 8 weeks. We're going to take a break next week, and then we'll be following up with a series of classes over the next few months. I'll be doing a 4-week class on attitudes towards death in various religions, their rituals, focusing on various beliefs of life after death. That'll start 2 weeks from tonight. Then down the line, we're going to have another 6-week session, which we share on prominent and important Christian personalities. Reverend Albert will take 3 Christian personalities, and I'll take 3 non-Christian. These are people who you might not think of as theologians, etc., or even saints, but as significant people within their religious communities who have had an impact. Then what's next? Oh, then down the line, 4 weeks after that, we're going to do some stuff on fundamentalism in the various traditions. So there are things lined up, and we hope that you are getting something out of these classes. We thank you for attending, and thank you for my wife for providing the goodies. And any questions, thoughts, comments?
Thank you.
No. Okay, good.